Welcome to Study Faith with AI, where we use the power of AI to help you explore the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
I'm Meg Jensen,
And I'm Paul Carter.
and we're Google AIs. Whether you're a lifelong member or just starting to learn about the church, we're here to dive deep into its history, beliefs, and culture.
So if you're ready to learn, you're in the right place.
That's right.
Let's get started. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving into something, a listener request, actually. We're going to unpack some of the criticisms surrounding Joseph Smith's polygamy, back in the early days of the church.
Yeah, fascinating stuff, and pretty complex, too.
Definitely complex. And to be clear, we're focusing specifically on Joseph Smith himself. His actions, his words, what motivated him, all from a critical perspective.
Right. And just to emphasize, we're looking at this strictly through the lens of the sources the listener provided. We're really trying to honor their request to see this from that critical angle.
Exactly. And speaking of those sources, there's a pretty diverse mix. We've got historical accounts and personal testimonies, even analyses of church doctrine. It's interesting because all of them, they all kind of raise some tough questions about how Joseph Smith navigated this whole polygamy thing.
Yeah. And that's where our deep dive comes in. We're taking a look at these sources together, trying to understand that context, and really we're digging deep into the criticisms that were aimed at Joseph Smith.
Okay, so where do we even start? There's so much to unpack.
Well, one of the most interesting places to start might be with Fanny Alger.
Oh yeah, Fanny Alger.
This relationship, a lot of people see it as the very beginning of Joseph Smith's polygamy. And it brings up a lot of questions.
Right. I was reading about that too. Because this all happened before there was any official revelation on polygamy. It even predates the idea of sealings.
Exactly. And that's a major sticking point for critics. It raises questions, Was this relationship really about divine mandate, or was it more about personal desire? Was this, was it a case of infidelity?
Yeah, especially since the sources suggest that Emma Smith, Joseph's wife, might not even have been aware of this relationship.
Right. And if you look at that in the timeline of events, it really makes you think about Joseph Smith's motivations, at this early stage.
Mhm.
Was he already starting to experiment with these ideas that would later be formalized, or was there something else going on?
Yeah, it's a question that really hangs over this entire period. And then things get even more complicated when you bring in cases like Miranda Nancy Johnson Hyde.
Yeah,
Her situation really stood out to me.
absolutely. It's a really striking example because, well, she was already married to Orson Hyde, one of the apostles, and he was actually away on a mission, all the way to Jerusalem at the time.
Wow.
But she was still married to Joseph Smith. And that's where the term polyandry comes in.
Polyandry, right. So that's a woman having multiple husbands at the same time?
Exactly.
Wow. I could see why critics would point to that as, well, an example of how Joseph Smith's polygamy went beyond maybe what many would consider acceptable, even in the context of that time period.
Exactly. It raises some serious questions about consent, power dynamics, even deception within those polygamous relationships. And this wasn't an isolated thing either. The sources you sent, they mentioned several instances where Joseph Smith married women who were already married to other men.
Wow, so that definitely adds a whole other layer to things. And it really makes you think about the impact this all had, on everyone involved.
Yeah.
Especially the women. I mean, we're talking about their lives, their families, their whole sense of who they were.
Absolutely. And when you look at the experiences of some of these women, like Helen Mar Kimball, she was just 14 when she married Joseph Smith. It's hard not to feel the weight of that impact. These were young girls and women, often in very vulnerable positions, being told that their eternal salvation, like it all depended on their willingness to enter these polygamous unions.
Right. It's like, how could they even say no to that?
Yeah.
Especially when these pronouncements were coming from someone they considered a prophet. I mean, the pressure they must have felt. It's hard to even imagine.
Right. And that's another big criticism of Joseph Smith, that potential for coercion. Critics say he used his prophetic authority, to influence these women, promising them blessings, even threatening consequences if they didn't enter into these relationships.
It definitely makes you question whether these women had genuine free will and whether their consent was truly informed. Plus, the fact that so many of these relationships were kept secret, it just makes it feel like something wasn't right.
Yes. The secrecy surrounding Joseph Smith's polygamy is a huge point of contention for critics. They argue that it points to a desire to hide something, to operate outside of what was considered socially acceptable.
Yeah, and, it wasn't just Emma Smith who was kept in the dark. It seems like Joseph Smith was misleading the entire church membership about this.
Absolutely. The sources highlight instances where he and other church leaders, they went to great lengths to deny that polygamy was happening, even while they were actively engaging in it.
Wow. So many layers of secrecy and deception.
It is. And it really begs the question, if this was truly ordained by God, why all the secrecy? Why the need to mislead so many people?
That's the question, isn't it? And we've barely scratched the surface here.
You're right. We need to take a closer look at the inconsistencies between Joseph Smith's actions and the later revelations on polygamy, like those found in D&C 132. There's a lot more there to unpack.
Definitely. And I'm also thinking about the impact this all had on Joseph Smith personally, his relationships and how the church developed in those early days.
Yeah, that's a really important part of the story, too. We'll delve into that more as we continue. Picking up where we left off, one of the most striking criticisms of Joseph Smith is how his practice of polygamy, well, it often just flat out contradicted the rules he claimed were from God.
So you're talking about that Revelation D&C 132, the one that lays out the rules for plural marriage.
Exactly. That revelation really emphasizes certain things, like getting the first wife's consent, making sure new wives are virgins, and the sources you provided, well, they highlight a bunch of instances where Joseph Smith seems to have just ignored all that.
Yeah, we already talked about Miranda Nancy Johnson Hyde, who was already married when Joseph Smith took her as a plural wife.
Hmm.
But there are so many other examples, too.
Absolutely. The sources talk about cases where Joseph Smith married women who were already married, sometimes without their husbands even knowing. And the fact that he married, several teenagers, some as young as 14, it just raises all sorts of ethical questions, especially from where we stand today.
I can see why critics would be so troubled by these inconsistencies. If he was really getting revelations from God, why wouldn't his actions match up with what was revealed? Were these just like convenient oversights, or is there something more to it?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? Critics argue that these inconsistencies, maybe they suggest a human element to how polygamy started. That maybe Joseph Smith's motives weren't entirely divine. Maybe there were personal desires mixed in there.
So instead of being purely religious, polygamy might have been influenced by things like, I don't know, power dynamics, social ambitions, or even just basic human desire.
That's one interpretation, and it's definitely a perspective that critics have put forward. The point to the secrecy around a lot of these relationships, the fact that they often involved women in vulnerable positions, and the emotional distress that many of these women experienced, all is evidence that something wasn't quite right.
Yeah, it's like the more we dig into this, the more complicated it gets.
Hmm.
And it makes you wonder about the impact, not just on the people directly involved, but on the early church as a whole.
Hmm.
I mean, we've talked about the criticisms aimed at Joseph Smith himself, but what about the ripple effects?
That's a great point. Joseph Smith's polygamy, it didn't happen in a vacuum. It had huge consequences for those around him, his family, close associates, even the entire church membership.
Right, we were talking earlier about dissent and division within the church over polygamy.
Hmm.
Can you tell us more about that? Who were some of the people who opposed Joseph Smith on this?
Well, one of the biggest names was William Law. He was Joseph Smith's second counselor in the first presidency. At first, Law supported Smith, but he became more and more disillusioned with polygamy, especially all the secrecy and how he saw women being coerced.
And that eventually led to a complete break between Law and Smith, right?
Exactly. Law felt so strongly about this that he started publishing a newspaper, the Nauvoo Expositor, and it exposed Smith's polygamy and other controversial practices.
And if I remember right, that newspaper became a huge source of conflict, eventually leading to Smith and the Nauvoo City Council destroying it. It's wild how this one practice could have such massive ripple effects.
It really is. And it wasn't just William Law. Several other people close to Smith, people who were really important in the early days of the church, they also had big problems with polygamy.
Like who? Anyone we might know.
Well, for example, there's Oliver Cowdery. He was one of the 3 witnesses of the Book of Mormon, and he was Smith's scribe during the translation. He raised concerns about polygamy, and ultimately he left the church, partly because of those disagreements.
So even those closest to Joseph Smith, the ones who shared in the foundational experiences of the church, they had doubts about polygamy. It really shows how controversial this whole thing was.
For sure. And then, of course, there's Emma Smith, Joseph's first wife. Her story is particularly powerful because it shows the personal toll that polygamy took on those closest to him.
I can only imagine how tough that must have been for her, to be asked to share her husband with all these other women, to go against her own marriage vows.
The sources you sent paint a picture of Emma being really conflicted about polygamy. It seems like she might have agreed to some of those early plural marriages at first, but then became more and more resistant as things progressed.
It makes sense. It must have been incredibly hard to watch her husband take more wives, especially with all the secrecy surrounding it all.
You're right. And the sources actually describe times when Emma confronted Joseph, demanding that he stop taking more wives. She's portrayed as being hurt, angry by his deception and all the secrecy.
It's sad to think about what she went through emotionally. It's clear that Joseph Smith's polygamy created a lot of strain in his own family.
Absolutely. And even though believers might accept the theological reasons for polygamy, we have to acknowledge the very real and painful human consequences. The stories of Emma Smith, William Law, Oliver Cowdery, and countless others, they all show that polygamy wasn't just some abstract idea. It had a real impact on people's lives, their relationships, and their faith.
It's like this one practice had a huge impact on the entire early church. It caused division, heartache, and it even contributed to the persecution that the Mormons faced.
That's a good point. Joseph Smith's polygamy wasn't just a personal matter, it became part of the early church's very identity. It shaped its development, its internal dynamics, and even how it interacted with the outside world.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. We've explored those criticisms of Joseph Smith's polygamy, the inconsistencies in his actions, and how it affected those around him. But there's still more to consider, right?
Absolutely. We need to look at how all this played out in the long run. What happened after Joseph Smith died? How did the church deal with this legacy of polygamy?
So we've spent this deep dive really looking into the criticisms of Joseph Smith's polygamy. It's been a fascinating journey and challenging too, through history, personal accounts, all of that.
Yeah, it really has. We've looked at those inconsistencies, between what Joseph Smith did and those later revelations on polygamy. We've talked about the potential for coercion, for deception, and we've considered that impact, that deep impact this practice had on everyone around him.
And now I think it's time to talk about what happened afterward, after Joseph Smith's death. How did the church deal with that legacy of polygamy?
That's a really important question. Because the impact of Joseph Smith's actions, it went way beyond his own lifetime. I mean, the church kept practicing polygamy for decades after he died, even with all the persecution, legal challenges, everything.
It seems like that one practice, it really became a defining issue for the early church. It shaped its identity, how it was seen by the outside world, even the struggles it had internally.
Absolutely. And as you can imagine, the criticisms, the ones originally aimed at Joseph Smith, they didn't go away. They continued to be leveled at his successors, at the church as a whole.
So how did the church handle all that? I mean, polygamy isn't practiced in the mainstream LDS church today. We know that.
Right. And that didn't change overnight. It was a long process, complicated too. It involved debates within the church, changing societal norms, even political pressure.
I was reading about that Edmunds-Tucker Act of 1887. It seems like that was a big turning point.
Yeah, it was. That was a major piece of legislation. It was designed to take away the church's political and economic power out in Utah. It disincorporated the church, took its assets, and made polygamy a felony.
Wow, that's pretty serious.
It was. And it put a lot of pressure on the church. They had to rethink their stance on polygamy.
So what happened then? Did the church stop practicing polygamy right away?
Not immediately. There was still some resistance from certain groups in the church. And it took a few more years before things really shifted. In 1890, church president Wilford Woodruff issued what's called the Manifesto. It officially declared an end to the practice of polygamy.
So that's when it officially ended in the LDS church. What about the people who wanted to keep practicing it, though?
Well, that's where it gets even more interesting. Some members just wouldn't accept the manifesto. They broke away from the main church and formed their own groups, fundamentalist groups, and they still practice polygamy to this day.
So polygamy's legacy lived on in these splinter groups, even after the mainstream LDS church abandoned it.
Exactly. And those groups, they still face scrutiny, legal problems because of their practice. It's a reminder that the choices Joseph Smith made over a century ago, they still affect people today.
It's pretty amazing how history can echo through time and shape people's lives and beliefs even now.
It really is. And that's what makes studying history so captivating, so important. It gives us a deeper understanding of where we are today by looking at the decisions and actions of those who came before us.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the most important thing you'd want our listener to take away?
I think it's really important for listeners to remember what we've discussed is just one perspective. It's a perspective that focuses on those criticisms of Joseph Smith, of his polygamy. But there are other perspectives too. Some people believe polygamy was commanded by God.
You're right. Like with any historical topic, it's crucial to look at different viewpoints, to think critically about the evidence, and to talk about it all thoughtfully.
Exactly. In the end, it's up to each person to figure out what they believe, and that should come from their own research, their own reflection, and their own personal beliefs.
Well said. So to our listeners, we really encourage you to keep learning about this topic. Seek out those diverse viewpoints and engage with this history, but do it in a nuanced, critical way.
And as you do that, remember that it's good to ask questions, challenge what you think you know, and grapple with the tough stuff. That's all part of the process.
Thanks for being with us on this deep dive into the criticisms surrounding Joseph Smith and his practice of polygamy. It's been a fascinating journey, and we hope you'll join us again as we take another deep dive into a topic that matters to you.
If you find value in this exploration, please like, share, follow, and consider becoming a subscriber. Your contributions help keep these conversations going and allows us to maintain the highest quality production. You can find all the details at studyfaithwithai.com. Thank you for being part of this journey.